Well, you guys, it's here. New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani has just announced that he is, yes, freezing the rent on certain properties.
New York, the Independent Rent Guidelines Board just froze the rent. That means if you're one of the more than 2 million New Yorkers who lives in a rent-stabilized apartment, your rent's going to be frozen next year. I wanted to come and bring everybody a happy rent freeze cake. I know it's not yet 9 o'clock. It might be a little early for cake.
We don't care. Happy rent free.
The celebration might be a bit premature. To not go belly up, these landlords are gonna have to cut their amenities, maybe fire their live-in handyman, or just sell the building because it ain't worth it anymore. This is going to be so bad for landlords and tenants.
We'll have to lay off people. We'll have to lay off some of the supers. Only choice. It's a business. People don't get it. This is a business. It's not a choice that you think this is for free.
Landlords speaking out about the burden of maintaining buildings.
My property tax on a small little building is $35,000 a year. Divide that into 3 apartments. That's $1,000 a month. I had to raise their rent twice. Now the tax is going up again.
For people who think this guy is just throwing numbers out there because he's upset about the rent freeze, just take a look at this. This is New York City property taxes on average broken down per unit. On a mid average, you're looking at about $650 per unit in property taxes. On the higher end luxury units like condos and prime locations, which is a lot of New York, you're looking at $800 to $1,500 per month per unit. And that's just in property taxes. I mean, this in itself is just so mind-blowing.
So the way this works is that the Rent Guidelines Board meets on an annual basis in New York City to set rents for rent-stabilized apartments, which impacts around 1 million apartments citywide. This year, the board voted not to increase the rent at all, so all New Yorkers living in rent-stabilized apartments will not see a rent increase in 2027. 6 of the 9 members on the Rent Guidelines Board were appointed by, you guessed it, Mamdani, and they all decided that there would be absolutely no rent increases for these rent-stabilized apartments. Seems a bit rigged. Ahead of the vote, one landlord resigned from the board. Her name was Christina Smith. She was the board's lone landlord representative, and she said she believed the outcome of the vote had already been decided before the process had happened. She said that the board's hearings, data, and public comments were basically just performative. It was all theater, and that the majority of those members ignored the evidence of rising operating, insurance, and property tax costs that were confronting landlords. And instead, they moved toward a rent freeze for political reasons to appease Mamdani's left-wing base in New York City, not because it actually made mathematical or economic sense. Here's a landlord in Chinatown.
They're not even hiding the bias anymore. The mayor had campaigned on a rent freeze. He appoints 75% of the board, and now he's got his hand on the scale. If we keep eroding one side of the equation, something's got to give, and the people in those buildings are going to suffer. So there has to be some kind of fairness and recognition of the math.
When landlords raise the rent every year, naive opinion says that's because they're greedy. They're trying to squeeze tenants of every penny while they're just scraping by, trying to make it in the Big Apple. But actually, the reason why rent increases is because it's usually covering the annual tax and operations increases. In other words, the costs don't freeze. They often rise every year for landlords. Someone has to eat those costs, and that hurts the janitors, porters, handymen, cleaners, everyone who keeps a building functional. The owner of the building has to cut the operating budget to make ends meet, and the operating budget is often made up of personnel who have wages or salaries, so they gotta go. Now, not every building will have to make severe cuts. In buildings that have a combination of stabilized and market rate rents, those cost increases get pushed onto market rate tenants, which means New York City rent overall becomes costlier, not less. In those buildings, freeze the rent is just moving the cost from one group of tenants to another group of tenants. So you're basically subsidizing the person who lives down the street. And rent stabilization isn't for the neediest of New York City residents, by the way. It's not means tested. 30% of rent stabilized tenants have a 6-figure income. So someone earning $350,000 might live in a stabilized apartment, while someone earning $60,000 doesn't. You get a rent-stabilized unit. Basically, sometimes you get a rent-stabilized unit because you got lucky, or word of mouth. You hear about a building from a friend who lives in the Upper West Side, or maybe you're part of some sort of group chat, or you go to some pickleball court for the day and you hear about one that has open available listings. So these rent-stabilized buildings are going to degenerate and deteriorate. That's going to push market rate rents higher, all for the benefit of random people, not low-income people who just got lucky. A report from the Rent Guidelines Board released in April said that rent-stabilized housing insurance increased by 10.5% in 2026 year over year, and that other costs increased as well. The rent increases, again, are to cover that extra expense, not to line the pockets of landlords. Now, Mamdani's other campaign promise was to seize private property from landlords who do not make mandated repairs or pay assessed fines on their properties. But meanwhile, by freezing the rent, Mamdani is making it exceedingly difficult for those landlords to run their business by capping what they can charge tenants. But once they fall into disrepair, which is inevitable, then the city government can say, oh, you're neglecting your building, which could lead to fines and audits and eventually private property seizure. But that was the plan all along. Confiscation. Bill Ackman had a great thread on X. He goes, imagine your family worked for a generation to save enough money to buy a brownstone occupied with rent-stabilized tenants on the Upper West Side. The family financed the purchase with a mortgage from a bank based on the premise that rents and cash flow would at least keep pace with inflation. So you could pay interest and principal on the mortgage and hopefully have some cash flow left as a return on your investment. While you had rent-stabilized tenants, you were led to believe that the NYC Rent Guidelines Board would be required to adjudicate rental increases each year by taking a measure of the inflation of costs to own and operate a building and setting rental increases appropriately, which this time the Rental Guidelines Board did not do. You believe the board would do its job, as the board is comprised of 2 representatives, each for landlords and tenants, and 5 independent representatives that represent the general public. Now, a new mayor, Mamdani, a socialist, is elected on the promise of freezing rents. There are about 2 million rent-stabilized renters that benefit if rents are frozen, so by promising frozen rents, the new candidate for mayor buys votes and wins the election. The new mayor achieves his objective by stacking the board with directors who do not follow their obligations and simply vote for a rent freeze as a preordained conclusion, as evidenced by the statements of a board director who resigned in protest for this very reason. This is exactly what happened. Meanwhile, inflation in New York City is rampant in utilities, real estate taxes, insurance, repairs, and maintenance, etc., and now your rents are frozen. And by the way, all those costs that are skyrocketing, largely because of extra regulation and red tape that progressive governance wants. So they are causing the root problem, but instead of fixing it, they are prescribing a band-aid that demonizes, if not runs out of business, landlords. Bill Ackman goes on, real estate is a high operating leverage business, which means that frozen rents and inflating expenses will cause property cash flows to plummet and your after-debt service cash flow to go negative. I expect, therefore, there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of small New York City property owners who are now or will shortly be underwater on their mortgages and without any cash flow to maintain their assets. If you remember the images of the South Bronx burning in the mid-1970s, you can viscerally understand what is happening to small New York City real estate owners, who, by the way, could be considered, small businesses. They're very much the backbone of this city too, Mamdani. Ackman continues, while the rent freeze appears to be short-term good news, long-term, it will lead to poorly maintained apartments for 2 million New York City renters. It is bad news for the 2 million or more renters in the 1 million market rate apartments in the city, because a landlord-hostile market is not likely to add meaningfully more supply, and market rents will likely continue to escalate at a high rate. In other words, the rest of us who don't have a rent-stabilized apartment are going to also end up incurring the cost of this ridiculous, asinine, and frankly unethical policy. So guys, the rent freeze, coupled with increased property taxes and all those other crazy expenses that landlords get slapped with every year, is specifically designed to force landlords to sell their rental properties. And who do you think is going to buy them? Well, eventually the only entity that will be able to afford to own residential buildings is the government. This is the slippery slope that always happens under socialism, communism. They're synonymous, right? They're really giving the game away here. If you just dig a little deeper, Mamdani and the radical socialists in the Democratic Party want property owners to default or be otherwise financially suffocated, because then the city or state government can swoop in. Maybe it's repackaged as a new LLC agency the government is hiding behind, and they're gonna offer to buy the properties to put them out of their misery, to end their suffering. Voila! More power concentrated in the government, which now has increased authority and oversight over where and how people live. That's the goal. Thanks for watching. Make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below and hit that subscribe button to keep the party going. I'm Caroline Downey of National Review, signing off.